Hello and welcome once again to Saturday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, let's see, we've got hazardous weather graphic. There's a winter storm warning out for until midnight tonight. Actually, I'm sorry, midnight Sunday night, and that's for the southeastern Brooks Range and the eastern North Slope areas there for 6 to 8 inches of snow to fall tonight through tomorrow and into tomorrow night in that area. And then there's a winter weather advisory out for the southeastern Brooks Range, the Koyukuk Valley, on down into the Kuskokwim Valley. And that's out tonight and Sunday for those areas, and looking for 4 to 7 inches of snow there. And then on down to the south, there's a wind advisory for the Alaska Range, and that's out for tonight into tomorrow for winds gusting to 55 miles per hour. And then for the Klondike Highway, there's a winter weather advisory out for snow tonight, 3 to 7 inches with winds gusting to 45 miles an hour. That takes care of all the watches and warnings and advisories. So moving on to satellite imagery, you can see front pushing across the southeast coast, another band of moisture pushing into the northern panhandle today, keeping it wet and windy over the northern southeast coast and the central areas. And then bands of moisture moving into the eastern interior from south-southwest to north-northeast. Actually kind of an enhancement of the Alaska Range there, producing kind of a mid- and high-level cloud situation over into the Tanana Valley. And gusty south winds in the Copper River Basin, as well as portions of south-central Alaska today, and allowing temperatures to rise into the 40s. Gulf Canada seeing winds gust to about 30-35 miles an hour today, with temperature pushing up near 40. In Palmer, 45 degrees with southeast winds to about 32 miles an hour. Colder air back out to the west in northerly flow there, coming down through the Bering Strait and into the western interior today, with some areas of snow. Anywhere from 3 to 5 inches fell in the Kuskokwim Valley today. That was the area of the heaviest snowfall, with lighter amounts to the west and north, and also to the east into the Alaska Range. Otherwise, precipitation along the North Gulf Coast ranged from 1/4 of an inch at Ninilchik in southern Cook Inlet there in the Kenai Peninsula. Soldovia picked up 1/2 inch, and Seward had 1.5 inches of rain today. And also into the northern panhandle, Juneau had 0.4 of an inch, with southeast winds gusting to 35 miles an hour. It was a windy day out along the southwest coast as well, with Kipnuk seeing winds gusting to 43 miles an hour from the north and northeast. Tuksuk Bay, peak wind gust 56 miles per hour, and Cape Romanzoff had a peak wind gust of 69 miles per hour. Winds are much lighter with less gradient across the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians today, with areas of rain in that area. Snow extending up to the western Arctic coast, mostly dry in the eastern Arctic coast, as well as areas north of the Alaska Range there, with that southerly flow downsloping, bringing areas of drier conditions there into the eastern mid and upper Tanana Valley on up into the Yukon Flats area. And for tonight, that pattern will continue, stay pretty breezy, mild over the Copper River Basin, with precipitation mostly near the mountainous terrain, upslope areas, and rain and snow for the North Gulf Coast, and warm front rains start to spread into the central and south coast of the Panhandle, with the winter weather advisory again for the Klondike Highway out for tonight, and could see up to 3 to 7 inches of snow there in that area, with some rain and snow showers over Kodiak Island, or rain and snow areas of into Bristol Bay. Another weak low there over the central Aleutians keeps it cloudy and unsettled for the entire Aleutian chain, with the trough extending back to the west. Stays windy along the southwest coast there, possible areas of blowing snow, and areas of snow along that trough, mostly along the trough and then to the west and northwest, all the way up to the Arctic coast there. Could see several inches of snow in some areas, and then it dries out again out toward the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue, Kivalina, on down along the Yukon Delta coast. Maybe some snow showers and that continued northerly flow through the Bering Strait into St. Lawrence Island. And for tomorrow, that low center southeast of Kodiak Island later tonight, tracks northward right into the Kenai Peninsula or possibly Cook Inlet tomorrow afternoon. That'll bring gale force winds into the North Gulf Coast with rain continuing moderate to possibly heavy at times from Prince William Sound eastward in toward Yakutat, with that warm front spreading rain heaviest over the northern panhandle, lighter amounts down to the south. Areas of snow over much of the central and eastern interior, spreading northward to the eastern Arctic coast. Pretty light up that way north of the Brooks Range. And stays breezy. Winds coming down a little bit, but not all that much. Probably see still windy conditions, possible blowing and drifting snow, Yukon Delta and the lower Yukon Valley, maybe up in the Koyukuk Valley as well, but nothing too serious. And again, mostly clear. Seward Peninsula, drier and colder up in that area, with periods of snow continuing for the Kuskokwim Valley, and some rain and snow south central Alaska, rain along the North Gulf Coast, rain and snow showers, Alaska Peninsula, and the eastern Aleutians drying out over the central Aleutians. Outlook for Monday, next big storm comes into the far western Bering Sea there. Low center still back toward Kamchatka Peninsula, but the frontal boundary bringing a big slug of moisture northward with widespread rains coming into the southwest Bering Sea, pushing eastward to about Atka Island late in the afternoon. More likely, though, Adak. High pressure in advance of that, clearing it out over the eastern Bering Sea and the western interior with colder temperatures there, and stays cloudy and with areas of snow and snow showers over the central and eastern part of the state, and rain and snow showers for the North Gulf Coast. Chance of snow is the Sitna Manduska Valley, clearing for the Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island. Lows tonight, mostly in the upper 30s to mid 40s for the Panhandle, and 20s to lower 30s for the inland areas of south central and southern Alaska, upper 30s Kodiak Island. Highs tomorrow, mid to upper 30s to near 40 for Palmer, Anchorage, Kenai, mid 40s down toward Homer and Seward, upper 30s, lower 40s, Bristol Bay, mid 40s Kodiak Island, and in the 40s for the Panhandle, followed by lows. A little colder in the Kuskokwim Valley now, 15 to 25 there, upper 20s Bristol Bay, upper 30s Kodiak Island, otherwise 20s to lower 30s elsewhere. Panhandle, 30s to lower 40s, and the highs in the 40s for the southeast coast, 30s to near 40 again, southern Alaska. Colder west of the Alaska Range there, 30s for Bristol Bay, and up north, single numbers and teens for the lows tonight, followed by highs in the teens to lower 20s, mid 20s to the central interior and out toward the Bering Strait, followed by lows still above zero, but edging down towards zero in the Brooks Range to the Koyukuk and Kobuk Valley areas, as well as the Noatak Valley, followed by highs, single numbers, teens to near 20, warmest in the Fairbanks and North Pole area. Out to the west coast, lows in the teens and lower 20s for the southwest coast, otherwise 30s for the Aleutians, highs upper 20s for the southwest coast, 40s for the Aleutians, followed by lows lower 30s in the Aleutians with highs 40 to 45.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, a lot of IFR moving up into the Gulf of Alaska and into the Panhandle associated with a warm front, and then another zone of IFR from south central interior back to the southwest across Dillingham, Togiak, and into southeast Bering Sea, north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Shows you with a trough there, and also moisture creating IFR conditions from the northern Kobuk, Koyukuk valleys across the central Brooks Range up to the eastern Arctic coast. And for the afternoon, we've got IFR across southern Alaska becoming marginal VFR over Cook Inlet and the western Kenai Peninsula, marginal VFR for Kodiak Island and the southeast Bering, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians. VFR, Adak, Atka to Kiska, back to marginal for Shimei and Attu. Pretty good VFR up across Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, most of St. Lawrence Island into the northwest interior, and the central eastern Brooks Range, some IFR. Also IFR for the North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, southern southeast coast, be seeing some VFR tomorrow afternoon. That'll be replaced by marginal VFR as IFR increases over the central and northern southeast coast and extends west-northwestward across the Copper River Basin, northeast Prince William Sound, Talkeetnas into the Susitna Valley up to the Alaska Range, and some IFR over the southwest interior as well, Kuskokwim Valley areas, Kuskokwim Mountains, and up over the central Brooks Range extending out to the eastern Arctic coast. And another batch of IFR just coming onto the picture there, pushing into Shimian at 2 in the afternoon. But a pretty good break, Adak-Atka into the Pribilof, St. Matthew Island, and again northeastward, Norton Sound, Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue into Noatak. And that improves even further. Good VFR over the west coast, marginal VFR from the Kuskokwim Delta, southeast Kuskokwim Delta, Bristol Bay, up across the western central Alaska Peninsula, and much of the central and eastern interior, some lingering IFR there over the mid and upper Tanana Valley areas, 40-mile country, as well as the northern panhandle, some IFR, but better conditions off to the south and southeast. IFR pushing into the western Aleutians, southwest Bering Sea, but good VFR there over the eastern and central Bering Sea, including the Fox Islands northward through the Bering Strait. And Atuvik, IFR tomorrow, Adigan, same forecast, IFR flying conditions there, Lake Clark and Merrill. Looks like an IFR day mostly for both passes. Rainy, same thing, IFR for Sunday. Windy, IFR, especially in the pass and to the south, a little bit better out the north entrance, maybe marginal VFR as you get into the Tanana Valley. But Isabel, IFR, Mentasta, IFR, especially southern approach. Tanita, occasional IFR tomorrow. And Portage, IFR, Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 to 4,000 feet over the Gulf of Alaska and the Panhandle, otherwise 2,000 feet well south of the Aleutians, and at the surface there in over southern Alaska. And for icing, areas of isolated moderate rime icing, much of the central and eastern interior areas down to the North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska, and then along frontal boundary there extending southwestward across the Fox Islands. And looking at the jet stream, trough along the west coast to the Alaska Peninsula, south-southwest flow, 115 knots right up into Prince William Sound in the southeast interior, a little lighter over the northern panhandle, northwest 135 knots way out over the western Aleutians. Taking a look at 9,000 feet, again low complex, one upper low there at this elevation over the mostly over the northern Kobuk Valley there, southwest 35 knots over the eastern Brooks Range area, but northeast 50 knots there along the Yukon Delta coastline. Diminishes to 35 knots over the eastern Aleutians, but with the low there, near Kamishak Bay, southerly winds 55 to 70 knots right up in across the Gulf of Alaska, North Gulf Coast into the southeast interior. And at 3,000 feet, lighter winds at this elevation, about 55 knots are coming into the southern Gulf of Alaska from the south as that low tracks up into the Cook Inlet area or the Kenai Peninsula. Southerly winds about 35 knots, increasing along the central and north coast of the Panhandle, and 50-knot northeast winds across the Yukon Delta, 45 knots for the eastern Aleutians. Turbulence, considerable moderate chop for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound into the Wrangell Mountains, and the northern three-quarters of the Panhandle, as well as the Seward Peninsula into the western Brooks Range area, Kotzebue Sound, and Atka Island eastward to about Nikolsky.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles and nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Looking at today's sea ice analysis, the most notable change is along the southern Chukchi Sea and how the eastward progression of the heavier sea ice there toward the northwest coast. And that'll probably continue for another day or so, which means it may reach the Point Hope area or area north of Kivalina, possibly later Monday. That's just a chance at this point. Otherwise, not much change elsewhere from what we had yesterday. Moving on to the coastal water forecast. South winds 20 knots for the southern coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, seas 15 feet. And small craft advisories for the north coast, south winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Lynn Canal, southeast winds 25 knots with higher gusts, southeast 25 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, east winds 20 knots, seas 7 feet. For Monday, Clarence Strait, east winds 10 knots, seas down to 2 feet now, and the central and northern inner channels looking at southeast winds at 15 knots. Small craft advisories for the south coast, 25 knot winds from the southeast, and east-southeast winds at 30 knots for the north coast. Prince William Sound for Sunday, southeast winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, south to southeast winds 35 knots with 16-foot seas. And then east winds at 20 knots for the Barren Islands, southeast 20 for Kamishak Bay and southern Cook Inlet, northern Cook Inlet, east winds 15 knots. And for Monday, west-southwest winds 15 knots for Cook Inlet, west at 20 for Kamishak Bay, northwest 15 for the Barren Islands, but seas up around 11 feet. And for the North Gulf Coast, winds will be mostly northwest at around 20 knots. Prince William Sound, northwest wind 15 knots there with seas down to 2 feet. Kodiak Island on Sunday, southwest winds 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 20 knots, seas around 10 feet. And small craft advisories for Bristol Bay, south winds at 25 knots. And then for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula Monday, north winds at 15 knots. Pacific side, northeast at 20 knots. Bristol Bay, southwest winds 15 knots. And northwest to northeast winds for Kodiak Island at 20 knots. For the eastern Aleutians, variable to west winds at 20 to 25 knots. And small craft advisories for north to northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Central Aleutians, western Aleutians, north to northwest winds 15 to 25 knots. And then on Monday, that stronger system coming in out to the west there. Look for winds to switch around to the south for the western Aleutians, pick up to 40 knots and 30 to 35 knot winds in the afternoon for Adak and Atka. Eastern Aleutians, east to northeast winds at 20 to 30 knots with seas as high as 10 feet. Pribilof Islands, Kuskokwim Delta Coast, and St. Matthew Island. Tomorrow, Sunday, north winds 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Yukon Delta Coast and St. Lawrence Island. North winds 35 knots. And then for Monday, north winds 20 knots. St. Lawrence Island, small craft advisories on the southwest coast. North to northeast winds at 25 knots. East winds at 30 knots for the Pribilofs. And St. Matthew Island, north and northwest Bering Sea, gale warnings southeast at 45 knots. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea coast for Sunday, west to north winds 10 to 15 knots, north at 20 for the central coast. South winds 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. And then for the Chukchi Sea, north winds 20 to 25 knots. Moving ahead to Monday, we've got east to north winds 15 knots for the southern Chukchi Sea on Monday, and south winds 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. Central coast, variable to southwest breeze at 10 knots. And northeast winds 10 to 15 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. For tonight, winter storm warning until midnight tonight for the eastern North Slope, northeastern Brooks Range area for continued snowfall. And winter weather advisories over the Yukon River area up to the northeast to the southeastern Brooks Range tonight into Sunday. And looks like rain increasing on the North Gulf Coast with that warm front moving northward. That'll become moderate to heavy for the eastern and central North Gulf Coast tomorrow afternoon with snow inland. A little touch and go there for the Copper River Basin with that increasing southerly wind with the low tracking northward, with precipitation lighter over the southern panhandle and snow in the interior with some areas of blowing snow. And then for Monday, central eastern interior, cloudy skies with areas of snow showers or light snow from the eastern Arctic coast southward in the Copper River Basin, Susitna Valley. Rain and snow showers for the North Gulf Coast, rain and snow for the Panhandle becoming showery to the south.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.